Deadlock has a lot of effects that are usually referred to as crowd control in MOBAs. Some of these things, like slows or stuns, you might already be familiar with from other games, but there's also a bunch of stuff here like a silence, a curse, a tether, an immobilization, or a disarm that can be a bit confusing, especially if you're new to the genre. And even if you're not new, well, the way that some of these crowd controls work, it might surprise you, actually, because it differs quite significantly when compared to other games. Did you know, for example, that you can simply warp stone out of roots? Or that you can use your items while being silenced? Or did you know that a Purge, which is something that is available on the debuff remover, also removes incoming effects that haven't been applied yet, like an incoming Warden's Cage, an incoming 7 stun, and even Bebop's bombs. If you keep getting hooked and then bombed by a Bebop, debuff remover is able to prevent nearly all of that damage. Now I've played MOBAs for at least 3000 hours already, and even I would not have guessed some of these interactions. So with this video, I wanted to more or less just do a Mythbuster type of episode, where I'll go over each type of crowd control effect, see what they do exactly, see what keyword jargon the developers like to use for which effects, and how everything just interacts with each other. Do note though that this is not the full-on item shop guide that I mentioned that I was making as well. This is just a good look at the crowd control in Deadlock and all of their counters. So yeah, if you want to know more about this, if you want to see some of these interactions, then well, let's just begin the video. Okay, so the way we're going to start this off is by first looking at all the negative effects, and then we're going to look at the counters, because I think it's important to understand what all the negative effects do first before we start looking at the options on how to deal with them. And that means that we're first going to look at the stun, which is, I think, the most straightforward thing on the list, but also the most oppressive one, because it simply prohibits you from doing anything at all. When you're stunned, you will not be able to move, you will not be able to use abilities or activate any items, you will not be able to shoot, nothing. Examples of stuns are 7's static charge ability, Ivy's stone form if it hits you on the way down, Dynamo's singularity ultimate ability, and even a Bebop's hook, which is partly a stun, but partly also just a simple displace. And that one is very strong as well. Be very wary of good hookers in Deadlock. Similar to the stun, but a little bit less oppressive, is a sleep, which at the time of writing this video is only available on one character, and that would be Haze with her sleep dagger. Now, a sleep is more or less the same as a stun. It also prohibits your character from moving, from using abilities, from using items. But the biggest difference with this is that when you end up taking damage, you will wake up and the so-called stun ends. So yes, that means as soon as Haze or someone else shoots you after you get hit by the dagger, you get full control of your character again and you can use your abilities again. The other big difference with the sleep dagger is that it isn't a hard interrupt. And that is very important because it means that it cannot be used to interrupt channeled abilities, which the stun can do. If you think of, for example, Warden, who needs to channel his ultimate ability for a couple of seconds before it is used, or even 7 with his Stormcloud ability, if you stun these heroes during their channels with a proper stun, it will actually cancel out the abilities. And the ultimate abilities, they will go on full cooldown. But since the sleep dagger isn't an interrupt, it doesn't actually do this. If you put a Warden to sleep while he is channeling his ultimate ability, the ult will still go through. If you sleep a 7 in his ultimate ability, he will fall down from the ground if he's in the air, because the movement part of his ultimate ability that keeps him locked in place, that gets disabled, but it will not actually interrupt the channel of the Stormcloud. It's an important difference to keep in mind so that you don't end up using your sleep dagger to try and counter a Dynamo ult, which is something that I did in the first couple of games of Deadlock that I played. The last distinction that we have to make with the sleep compared to a stun is that after you get hit by the sleep dagger, you're still able to move your character for a little bit of time. I think it's about a quarter of a second that you can still do something, which I know is a very small time window, but that just gives you a little bit more time to trying to get out of line of sight. The next thing on the list when it comes to crowd control is what the game usually refers to as an immobilization, or an immobilizer. But what we often refer to as players is just a simple root because it's faster and easier to remember. Now, a root is very similar to a stun in the way that it prohibits your character from moving or using any movement-based abilities. But you'll still be able to shoot your gun and you'll still be able to use any abilities that do not move your character around. An example of a route would be the trap that Great Talon has, or Warden's Cage, which a lot of new players seem to have a lot of trouble with as well. And with both of these, I see a lot of new players, when they get caught, they just give up and they stand still for a few seconds because they think it is more or less a stun. But no, when you get caught by these, you can still teabag, which makes it harder for your opponents to hit you. You can still shoot back at the opponents and you can still use your abilities. Bucket, for example, will still be able to use his coffin after he gets caught in a root, which just allows him to dodge all the damage together. And Ivy can also still use her stone form, which will also prevent any further damage. Deadlock also has a Tether type of crowd control, which falls somewhat into the same category as a root, but it isn't as oppressive because it doesn't lock you into one place specifically, it just prohibits you from moving out of a certain area. Vindicta's stake ability is a good example of that. You toss it on the ground and anybody that gets caught gets tethered to the center of that area for a little bit of time. With this one, it is important to remember that you can also still use your movement-based abilities. You are not prohibited from doing so, but if you, for example, try to teleport out of the area, you will simply be pulled back into the center, which in some cases, it's still a little bit buggy because, hey, we're still playing a closed alpha. Next, we have a silence. A silence is another form of crowd control, and it is in many ways the opposite of a root. You see, a silence doesn't restrict your movement in any way. You can still move around the same way as you always would, but it does prevent you from using any abilities at all. Examples of this would be Lady Geist's fully upgraded Life Drain, Paradox's fully upgraded Wall. You can buy the Silence Glyph item that is in the store, or you can buy Silence Bullets, which allows you to silence players for 2 seconds when you shoot at them with your gun. So yeah, there's plenty of ways to get a silence. And if that sounds pretty oppressive to you, well, you're not wrong. A silence is usually one of the strongest forms of CC in the game, right after the stun of course. But there are 2 things to keep in mind when it comes to being silenced in Deadlock specifically. The first thing is that while you cannot use abilities, you can still use all of the active items that you purchased. What I see, for example, a lot is a lot of Haze players put Silencer on their gun and then use it just before they pop their ultimate ability. And players that are somewhat new to the game generally don't know how to deal with this because they can't use their abilities to jump out. But keep in mind that with item usage, you can still Warp Stone out of the Haze ultimate ability. Or if you have Metal Skin, which temporarily makes you immune to bullets, you can still activate that even while silenced, and you will take 0 damage from Haze for the next 3 seconds going forward. Also, with the silence, keep in mind that much like with the sleep, the silence isn't a hard interrupt. So if you silence, for example, a Dynamo that is already in his ultimate ability, a silence will not prevent the channel, and he will just continue using his ultimate until the duration runs out. So yeah, a silence only prevents ability usage. It does not outright cancel them. Next up on our long list of crowd control, we have a Disarm, which just disables weapon usage for a limited amount of time. And good examples for this would be Mo and Krill's Sandblast and Bebop's upgraded grenade. Now it's important to note that a Disarm just applies to your weapon, which means that abilities that use weapons still get to go through for the most part. Haze, for example, her ultimate ability is Bullet Dance, which if we look at the description, makes her shoot her gun at players around in an area with 100% accuracy. A Disarm would not stop this ultimate ability from shooting. If we look at Paradox, for example, though, she also has an ability that is based off of her gun. With this one though, it works in the opposite, because with this ability, you are forced to use the mouse 1 button to actually shoot the bullet. And so in this case, a Disarm does actually prevent you from using this ability. Next up on the list, we of course have the different type of slows. The 2 main ones that we have is movement slows and rate of fire slows. And they do pretty much exactly what you expect them to. Not much of an explanation needed here, just movement slow makes you move slower and rate of fire slow makes you shoot your gun slower. The only thing really worth pointing out here is that the slowing bullets in the item shop that slow your opponents as you shoot them with your gun, they seem to scale with your weapon damage. So if you're standing, for example, next to somebody and you deal full damage with your gun, you'll see the slowing bullets lasting for the full duration. But if you then shoot someone across the map and hit them for just 1 damage, then the slow duration also gets reduced, and they're going to be slowed for only a split second. This works very much like the build-up time for Infernus's Afterburn, where the closer you are, the more stacks you get. And my best guess is that these are outliers because they would otherwise be very oppressive in the laning phase. You know, slowing bullets is only a 1250 item, so it's relatively easy to get even early on. And being able to slow players across the map with just a single bullet that does 1 damage, that would probably not feel too good. There's one more type of slow as well, which is exclusive to the hero Paradox and her charged gun. You see, if you use this thing, if you charge up your gun and shoot somebody with it, it doesn't just slow down their movement, it slows everything down for them, which includes their abilities. Paradox is this character that manipulates time, so to speak. And with this gun, you literally slow somebody down in game. Some people say that this gun might as well be a full-on stun because you're not really able to move and it lasts so long and you're not really able to do anything. But again, there are some key differences, which is mainly that this time slow, of course, doesn't interrupt anything. It just makes things really, really slow. So that means that if you try to use a Paradox gunshot on a Dynamo ult, well, it actually ends up extending the duration of Dynamo's ult because you're slowing him down in time. And it also means that if you get shot by a Paradox gun, then it is possible to use a Purge, like what you would have on a debuff remover, to instantly remove the slow. Another similar but still slightly different form of crowd control is what we typically refer to as a knockback or an air knock or a displace. I'm not sure what the official terminology is in Deadlock because every character that has an ability that is similar to this has a different wording for it, but examples of it would be the Lash Ground Slam after it's been upgraded twice, the Moankrill Burrow, the Dynamo Kinetic Pulse, or Bebop's Exploding Uppercut. You see, all of these abilities put the opponents in the air for a little bit or just in a predictable position where they will not be able to use their air dash to relocate, so it's almost like a stun. But the players caught in this will still be able to use the rest of their abilities, their items, they will be able to shoot their gun. You're able to do everything basically, and this is why we can't just refer to it as a normal stun. This displace or knockback or air knock also doesn't interrupt like a normal stun would, so you cannot use it to interrupt channeled abilities either. A special form of negative crowd control that is also only available in the shop is Curse, and this is a bit of an outlier. There's only one thing in the entire game that can curse players as of the making of this video. It might change later in the game's lifespan, and that is a tier 4 item in the shop called, you guessed it, Curse. A curse works very much like a silence, except it also prevents the affected player from using any items. Additionally, it also applies a Disarm, and on top of that, it also does act as an interrupt. So yes, in this case, if you're up against that same Dynamo who is constantly getting those good singularities off, then picking up a curse to outright interrupt the ult might just be the best way to go. So yes, a curse is very strong, it does just about everything except for prevent movement usage, but that's maybe also why it is so expensive and only available on one item. Another sort of outlier in the shop is the slowing hex, which just prevents players from using any movement-based abilities. So it's kind of this weird mix between a silence and a root, but it's just the worst of both really. Because you don't really prevent players from moving and you don't really prevent them from using abilities, just the ones that also apply to movement. Now I say it's the worst of both, but for 1250 it's still an extremely strong item because it also slows the opponents. And if you're up against something like a Pocket or an Infernus maybe that you just can't seem to catch, this type of item is extremely strong against them because they will not be able to run away or teleport for the duration. Do note though that as of the latest patch, a slowing hex does not interrupt movement-based abilities, it just prevents the usage of them. So if you use a slowing hex on a Vindicta or a Grey Talon that are already in the air, they will just keep flying. Previously, it would cause them to fall down, but that has since been patched. And that is it for all the ways that you can screw someone over and get screwed over in Deadlock, for the time being at least. I'm sure that as the game evolves, Valve is going to get more creative with all sorts of new different types of crowd control. But for those that aren't a big fan of getting stunned, hope is not completely lost because everything in here also has a counter. And a lot of items in the shop and abilities actually counter more than just one type of crowd control. So yeah, let's look at that now. Let's look at all the different types of anti-crowd control buttons in the game, which I'm not sure if that's the wording for it, but we'll just call it that. And we'll start off by looking at the biggest and baddest of them all, which is being unstoppable. Now, if you are unstoppable, you basically ignore all negative status effects in the game. You cannot be stunned, you cannot be slapped, you cannot be rooted, you cannot be silenced, you cannot even be cursed, and you cannot even be stopped by the Paradox Time slow gun. Nothing will stop you if you are unstoppable. It is the big bad screw everything button that comes in very handy if the enemies decided to go very crowd control heavy. There's an item in the shop that is literally called Unstoppable that will grant you this effect for 6 seconds on a 65-second cooldown. So you basically have this once per fight, use it wisely. And the thing is that, well, with this item you do have to use it preemptively if you want to avoid stuns or being cursed, because obviously when you're either stunned or cursed, you're unable to use items to begin with. So it isn't as much of a free win button as you might think against stuns. You have to use it preemptively and you have to be a bit smart about it. There's also currently one character in the game that has this effect built right into his kit, and that is Abrams with his fully upgraded ultimate ability. Right after casting this ultimate, it will give him Unstoppable all the way until he lands it on the ground and then for 3 seconds after, which makes this ultimate ability a very strong counter to a lot of the other big buttons in the game if you know how to use it properly. Now, I said that Abrams was the only character that has Unstoppable built into his kit, but that isn't entirely true. Yamato can also become unstoppable. It's the state she gets into right after popping her ultimate ability. But on top of that, Yamato also becomes unkillable, which means that her health cannot drop past 1 HP. I'm not sure if this ultimate is just a combination of 2 different effects, unstoppable and unkillable. It might very well be that in the future we'll get a hero that can become unkillable while not being unstoppable, or maybe an item of such, but as of now, this unkillable state is exclusive to Yamato only. The next form of anti-crowd control, maybe not as good, but still pretty strong, is called a Purge. We've already looked at it a bunch of times in this video, and a Purge doesn't make you immune to all status effects or crowd control like an Unstoppable does, but it does simply remove all the active ones currently applied to you. The hero Viscous, for example, has it as part of his kit, the little cube that he can use on himself or on his teammates that also purges all the negative status effects. And there is also, again, an item available in the shop for everybody to buy that is called a debuff remover, which is also a purge. Think about a slow, a silence, a root, any state of crowd control, again, even Bebop's grenade that has a detonation time, anything that gets put on you that is negative in any way, shape or form, you hit this button and it gets rid of it. A few exceptions to these, things that Purge does not remove, are things such as the Raid ult. And that is probably because the Raid ult isn't really a debuff or a negative effect that is applied to you, it is just a very slow moving projectile that will chase you until the end of times. So a debuff remover does not prevent a Raid ult from going your way, but luckily for us there is another form of anti-crowd control that can prevent you from getting stunned by a Raid ult. And that is simply being called Invincible, or something similar to that. I don't know what the official terminology is, but we'll go with Invincible for now. Being invincible is perhaps a state that is even more powerful than unstoppable, but it usually goes hand in hand with also not being able to do anything yourself. It's essentially a self-stun that also temporarily removes you from the fight, meaning that you cannot be targeted, you cannot take damage, and you aren't affected by anything else in the game. And these type of abilities usually require a lot of game knowledge and a lot of skill to use well. Examples of these are the Yamato ultimate ability, where during the channel time she isn't able to take any damage or be targeted by anything. There's the pocket satchel as well, where you hide in your little briefcase and then pop back out once the duration ends. There's Ivy Stoneform, which can also be put into this category. And there is an item in the shop that is called Ethereal Shift. It's on the spirit section, and that also puts you into an invincible state. Now you might ask me when these abilities are useful, and I'd say that, well, anytime you're going to take a lot of damage or get hit by a stun that you cannot dodge in any other way. The better that you get with these type of abilities and the better that you get at the game in general, the more negative status effects you'll be able to dodge with these abilities. Even throwables like Decay and Slowing Hacks and Silence Cliff, they can all be dodged with the state of invincibility if you time it well enough. But obviously, using these abilities too early or too late, it will have very dire consequences because you often just end up getting caught only to die. Moving on and looking at the shop a bit more, there are a bunch of special items that provide some very unique buffs that I would say also sort of fit into this video. They're not exactly counters to status effects, they're just counters to other things. But, you know, for the sake of this video, let's just look at them really quick. The first one on that list is an item called Metal Skin that straight up makes you immune to bullets and melee attacks. So it's sort of like unstoppable, but for damage. Again, very useful as a counter to Haze ults. And another very interesting item on the list is Rescue Beam, which, according to its description, just allows you to pull a teammate out of a bad situation. What it doesn't say though is that this Rescue Beam overrides any other pull effect that might be present on that teammate. If you think of Bebop's Hook, for example, or Vindicta's Tether, if you put a Rescue Beam on someone caught in either of those, it will instantly reset the state of that player. And if you pull someone with the Rescue Beam, it simply overrides almost anything else in the game. The only scenario where the Rescue Beam doesn't really work is with a Pocket Satchel and again with Ethereal Shift. So somewhere in the code there is a further distinction between different types of invincibility. Ivy Stoneform can be pulled, but Pocket Satchel cannot. So there is some differentiation there when it comes to certain items. I'm not sure how useful that information is, but hey, it might be useful to you if you ever end up using Rescue Beam and ever end up having to rescue an Ivy in Stoneform for some reason. The point I'm trying to make is that Rescue Beam is crazy strong in the hands of a good teammate, and it can single-handedly win games because it just overrides pretty much any form of crowd control out there. That doesn't mean we're going to pick the item, of course, because we only care about damage on the stat screen, so we go Glass Cannon on every single hero. But yeah, now you can at least tell your 5 other teammates to all go Rescue Beam for you. And I think that pretty much wraps it up for this video. That's all of the crowd control effects and what they do and the what ifs and how they interact with each other. Deadlock is of course not limited to just these things. There's all types of resistances, shields, sources of healing and healing boosters and reducers. There's damage over time effects, but I think all of those are more at home in a dedicated damage breakdown video, or maybe just a video on all the items in the shop, and that video is coming too in just a few days. I'm going to keep the uploads coming. With the success of the first few videos, I think it's safe to say we are pretty much a Deadlock channel now. I am so happy that this is working out. You know, making a channel shift like this is always a bit of a risky move. So to see everybody so enthusiastic about the guides I've made so far, it just brings me a lot of joy. So thank you so much for the nice comments too. Hopefully this is the start of a new and very lengthy journey. So yes, thank you all so much for watching again, and you will see me very soon.